What's up guys, my name is Ace, and with the massive amount of hype that's currently surrounding Battlefield 6, and from what I've seen, a ton of the Call of Duty audience planning on checking Battlefield out for the first time, or at least checking it out for the first time in a long time, I wanted to provide a general Battlefield tips video to help ease that transition primarily for Call of Duty players coming into Battlefield. Because while there are of course certain similarities and certain skills that will transfer over, Battlefield does have a very different gameplay style, and it's very important to be adapting and adjusting to that rather than just treating it like you would with Call of Duty, because if you do that, you're likely not going to be nearly as successful as you could potentially be. Now, to be clear up front, this is a beginner video. This is aimed at people that have either never touched Battlefield before, or they've maybe just barely played it, or they haven't played it in a long time and they just want a refresher. For anybody that actually plays Battlefield on a regular basis, you're probably not going to be learning much, if anything, new with this video. And diving right in, the first tip that I've got for you guys is watch Battlefield YouTubers. I'm primarily a Call of Duty YouTuber. I have dabbled with pretty much every Battlefield game with a few exceptions, but I am by no means a Battlefield expert. In fact, part of the reason I'm making this video is a refresher for me to get in the right mindset going into the Battlefield 6 beta, because a lot of the things on this list are things that just don't come naturally to me as somebody that primarily plays Call of Duty. So it's good to have a refresher. Sometimes I know what I need to do, but then when I actually get in the moment, I forget to do those things. So I think I'm definitely capable of providing a lot of value to you guys to help you bridge that gap. And depending on how much I like Battlefield 6, my plan at the moment is to get quite invested into it and learn a whole lot of things as I go and provide some very detailed tips like my usual Call of Duty style content. But at the end of the day, I'm not nearly as knowledgeable or invested in the franchise as the more dedicated Battlefield YouTubers, and I'm going to leave a list in the description below with a handful of top Battlefield creators that I'd recommend watching, or in some cases, these are people I've personally never heard of, but I asked Twitter for a list of some of their top Battlefield tip YouTubers, and I decided to include a few of them as well, especially ones that were coming up multiple times. If you're really looking to get invested into Battlefield, definitely follow the lead of people that are already really invested in Battlefield. But then outside of that, some more direct tips for getting into Battlefield. The first big one is take some time to really get your settings dialed in. Especially for controller players out there, that's often one of the sticking points going from Call of Duty into Battlefield is at least the default controller settings in Battlefield often feel pretty bad, and it takes a lot of tweaking and tuning to get it into a really good place. And the settings they provide are quite detailed and can be very overwhelming for a lot of people. Don't worry, this is actually the first video I have planned once the beta goes live. I've been working really hard to learn and dial in Battlefield settings, and I obviously just need to confirm and fine tune once we get access to the beta itself. But the plan with that is to at least give you a much better starting point than the default settings to work with, so you can have a significantly better controller feel that's more natural coming from Call of Duty. Next up, once you first dive into the game, as Call of Duty players, I would definitely recommend starting with one of these smaller modes, something like Domination, for instance. This is an 8v8 game mode rather than one of the really large-scale game modes. It's also taking place on smaller sections of the big maps. And if I'm not mistaken, there's no vehicles present in this as well, so it'll be much easier to get used to as a Call of Duty player before diving deeper into the more traditional Battlefield modes like Conquest or Breakthrough. Now, getting deeper into the Battlefield-specific tips, one of the biggest differences between Call of Duty and Battlefield is in Battlefield, there are tons of different ways that you can really meaningfully contribute to the team without racking up a bunch of kills. In fact, when I play Battlefield, I often see the people toward the top of the scoreboard are not the people with the most kills in the game. They're the ones that are reviving a ton of players or playing the objective super hard. And therefore, if as a new player you are struggling to get a lot of kills, that's okay. Don't get discouraged by that. There are other ways that you can play the game and really have a meaningful impact. And one of the best ways to do that is to be a really good medic. So play with the support class, get those defibrillators out, and just revive as many teammates as possible. Battlefield players love a good medic. Even if you are going negative on the scoreboard, you don't have very many kills, you've got a decent amount of deaths, as long as you are consistently reviving people, not only is your team going to love you, it's also going to award a lot of score for you. Now, in a similar vein to that, really pay attention to the different classes and the roles that they are meant to play based on their gear and their perks that they've got attached to the class. I know as Call of Duty players, Assault is going to be a very attractive option. It's going to be quite tempting, and it's totally fine to play Assault, by the way. But don't neglect the other classes, and if you really want to get the most of the Battlefield experience, try to branch out a little bit. Play Engineer and focus on taking out enemy vehicles while repairing your teammates' vehicles. Like I said, play support, focus on reviving people and providing them with the support bags that gives them health and ammo. Or maybe try out recon and hang back a little bit more, try sniping or playing with like a DMR. And most importantly, provide that overwatch and spot enemies at a distance, because that will help your teammates out quite a bit as they're pushing up. But with that, it's obviously important to understand the different classes and what their roles are and what their strengths and weaknesses are, as well as the gadgets that are attached to that. So that's another big thing getting into Battlefield. Take a little bit of time before you dive into the game to familiarize yourself with your loadout. And I mean every element of your loadout. Know exactly what your class role is, know what your gadgets do, what they're capable of, and don't neglect to use them. That is a huge weakness of mine and something I really have to work with. I often just get hung up on slaying out and getting a lot of kills, and while I can generally do that effectively, I notice I'm often forgetting to use my gadgets. And that really holds me back from being as effective as I potentially could be. After that, let's talk a little bit about squads. Squads are very important. So for those that aren't familiar, in the normal Battlefield game modes, you have your team of quite a few players, oftentimes like 32 players on a team, and then you've got your squad of 4 players. And your squad mates are going to be the most important people on your team because regardless of the class that you're playing, you are able to revive your squad mates and they are able to revive you. Whereas to revive other teammates that aren't in your squad, you have to be playing support. Additionally with squads, another reason it's so important is you are capable of spawning on your squad mates as long as they're alive and not currently in combat. So that means your squad mates also work as sort of like a mobile spawn beacon. So as a result, it's generally in your best interest to try to stay at least in the general vicinity of your squad mates and at least try to be working toward the same objective, play in the same general area of the map. So you can fully take advantage of the benefits that come with playing as a squad. Now, therefore, ideally, it's best to be playing with friends and communicating as well, talking with them on the mic. But I know for many players, myself included, we prefer just hopping in solo. And if you do that, still make an effort to try to stay with your squad mates. However, at the same time, there's always going to be those people that just sit in like random insignificant corners of the map. There's no point in hanging back and sticking with those guys. Sometimes you just got to get yourself in the fight, and that may mean getting away from your squad a little bit. But when viable at least, try to stay close to your squad mates, revive them whenever you can. Also, pay attention to who's alive in your squad. And if you notice you are the last alive in your squad, oftentimes it's in your best interest to back up a little bit, get yourself out of the fight so you're not in combat, and that will allow your squad mates to spawn on you, which is very important. There's nothing more frustrating than waiting in that respawn screen, wanting to spawn up on your squad mate, but they just keep engaging in battle over and over, even though they're the last alive in the squad, when there's plenty of opportunity for them to just back off for 5 seconds, let you spawn up on them, and now you have the numbers to challenge. Now, on the flip side of that, with squad spawns, another big thing to be aware of is when fighting enemies, when you run into one enemy, that often means there are more in the vicinity because people tend to stick with their squads or they tend to spawn on their squads, which naturally kind of groups them together. So when you do manage to find that single kill, just be on alert because it's often likely there are going to be squad mates in the vicinity as well. Now after that, let's get into some miscellaneous Battlefield tips. One of the big ones is when engaging at longer distances especially, fire your weapon in shorter bursts. Don't just go full auto like you normally would in Call of Duty. Because in Battlefield, there tends to be at least a little bit of bloom. I don't know exactly how much there's going to be in Battlefield 6. I don't think it's quite as much as some of the earlier Battlefield games, but I believe it's still there. And that means the longer that you're holding down that trigger, the longer that you're firing for, the more inaccurate your gun is getting. And that's often going to make it really hard to hit those enemies at really long ranges. Whereas when you fire in those short bursts, you've got a much tighter cone and you'll be able to take them out far more effectively. Now, somewhat similarly, especially if you're seeing enemies at a distance, if it's a situation where you're not really confident that you can just quickly spray them down and get the kill, don't forget to spot enemies. Spotting can be very valuable to the team because it marks those enemies for your teammates so they know exactly where those enemies are. So your teammates can then either help you get that kill, or at the very least, it just helps your teammates make better decisions with whatever they're currently working on and doing. And that's yet another area where even if you're not racking up a ton of kills, if you're spotting enemies like crazy, your teammates are gonna love you. Next up, this one may seem obvious to a lot of people because it is one of the key selling points of Battlefield, but this is don't neglect destruction. If there's that pesky camper that's just locking down the second floor of a building, for instance, instead of playing it like Call of Duty and trying to rush that player, just take out the wall or take out the floor if you've got some explosives available. And that goes along with being familiar with your loadout and seeing what you have available to you as far as things that can cause destruction. But basically just always be aware of that additional layer to the gameplay and try to think about your options because you tend to have quite a few options to approach things in Battlefield compared to many situations that you would run into in Call of Duty, for instance. As for the next tip, let's talk about a Call of Duty player's worst nightmare when they first get into Battlefield. This is vehicles. If you're going to be playing in those more traditional Battlefield modes like Conquest, for instance, you've really got to be aware of vehicles and the impacts that they can have, and always have some sort of a plan to either counter a vehicle or avoid a vehicle. Now this goes back to, once again, being familiar with your loadout, I would recommend trying to select at least something that can be used for counterplay against vehicles, whether that's something that allows you to directly deal damage against them, like C4 or a launcher, for instance, or something that's more of a soft counter, like smoke grenades. Smoke grenades can be excellent just for outmaneuvering vehicles or for getting across an area that a vehicle is locking down. That can provide an excellent temporary soft counter to a vehicle. In general, I find this is one of the areas that Call of Duty players tend to struggle with the most getting into Battlefield. And again, this is another area where I know I have to work on this for myself, but always just keep it in the back of your mind. What would I do right now in this situation if an enemy vehicle were to just suddenly roll up on me? And then finally, I've just got one last general tip for you guys that is somewhat useful in Call of Duty, but I would say especially useful in Battlefield, and this is flanking. Flanking tends to be incredibly effective in Battlefield because generally speaking, you have like main front lines of combat where people are just shooting back and forth at each other, and that's often where the average player will just be focusing all their attention, is all the bad guys in front of them, and therefore when you flank, you can often take people so off guard, and you can just wipe your way through squads and make some really big plays happen. And combine that with the fact that you're effectively acting like a mobile spawn beacon for your squad mates, that can multiply the power of a flank if you suddenly have your squad mates popping up on you after you get behind a bunch of enemies. Now, outside of that, there's obviously the basic FPS skills that you want to make sure you're brushed up on, but these are all things that also apply to Call of Duty. So the basics, like centering, making sure you're keeping your gun up and aimed roughly where you would expect to run into the next enemy. That way, when you do run into that enemy, you don't have to adjust your aim and then shoot. You can just start shooting the enemy player. Additionally, obviously, make sure you're moving from cover to cover. Be unpredictable. Don't re-peek the same spot over and over and over again, especially against a sniper. If you peek somewhere and you take a few shots at somebody and you know that they've seen you, don't re-peek that spot immediately after. Try to reposition yourself a bit. Also, your minimap. Just like in Call of Duty, the minimap is one of your most important tools in your arsenal. Pay attention to that minimap. Find out where your teammates are located. Don't just focus on chasing the red dots that pop up, but be aware of them and think of strategies for how you're going to deal with them. Basically, just don't neglect your minimap because it's extremely important. And there we go. That is going to wrap it up for just a bunch of really basic tips to help people transition from games like Call of Duty into Battlefield for the first time or for the first time in a long time. A big thing to keep in mind is it's a different game with a different gameplay style. Try to embrace it and don't go into the game thinking it's going to be just like Call of Duty. It is different, and you're going to have to adjust your gameplay as well as your expectations for what gameplay should look like accordingly. And of course, these are just the tips that I put together. I want to hear from you guys down below. If you are familiar with Battlefield, what other tips would you offer to Call of Duty players to help ease that transition over to Battlefield? Are there any key elements that I left off this list? If so, just let us know down below. If you enjoyed this video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.